and we're going to start talking about using the editable display array. At the end of this module, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the advantages of some of the additions that have been made to the display array over the last couple of years. So we'll talk about the advantages of display array over input array. We're going to manage user interactions with control blocks, and we're going to use modification triggers. And then when we finish talking about the use of the display array and coding with the display array, we'll look at some of the built-in find and seek features. So the first question, and this is a question I had when we first released this, is they said, well, we're going to make an editable display array. And my first thought was, well, why do we need that? We have an input array. And the answer that I have, and the answer that I'll show you now, is that it gives us two things. It gives us a more modern look and feel. It gives a look and feel of what people have come to expect from their desktop applications or from their mobile applications, from their web applications. So it's a more modern look and feel. And then when we get into the coding itself, the modification triggers have simplified programming. So first I want to show you the difference between the two. So I'm going to bring up Genero Studio. I have out here an input array and I have a display array statement. The input array, so I have my input array here. If I run my input array statement, this is a traditional input array. You can see I have a table here with 10 rows. As I move my cursor up and down the road, every field I go into is instantly editable. And then, so I'm always in edit mode as I move up and down. I don't have a lot of highlighting going on. I can insert, append, and delete. Those are automatic actions. But this is what we get when we have an input array statement. Let me go and then run a display array statement. So I have my display array code here. When I execute that display array, it allows me to do my display with my row being highlight as you expect a display arrayment. As I'm moving around the rows, they're not in edit mode yet. Apparently this display array, I've coded it such that when I double click on the row, it enters into edit mode. Then I have to cancel out of that to go back and do my reading again, and I still have my insert, delete, and append. So when people look at today's applications or modern applications, they more expect an application such as this. I expect to see my list of rows and be able to scroll up and down my rows and move up and down them and not really be in edit mode until I explicitly go in and want to go into edit mode. And I shouldn't have to close out of a display array and move over into an input array in order to get that edit feature. So it's all combined there in the one array that we put out. So display array, for the most part, is replacing input array when it comes to how we like to code applications or how people expect their applications to be seen today. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of these two applications. Let me go back to my slides. So the way a display array has been changed is we have our display array statement, but we have modification triggers. So we have an OnUpdate trigger. Let me grab my pen. We have an OnUpdate trigger, we have an OnInsert trigger, an Append, and OnDelete. So those are the four modifications we can expect to make to a display array statement. And each one, when you call one of these statements, you still have to, it automatically is going to give you an action for it. So if I have OnUpdate, I'll have an update action. When that update action is called, I need to tell it what to do. And that's what we have with the input statement. So you'll see update, insert, and append all have their input statements. And within these statements, we have two things that allow us to handle the fact that we have a row in our program array we're talking about, and we have a row in our screen array that we're talking about. So you'll see up here we have rcur, RRR-ARR-CURR. This identifies the current row in our program array, and you'll notice each one of these uses that. You'll also notice that we have this screenLine function, or screenLine method, and that's identifying the row in the current screen line. So because of these, we can do our input statements. We know which row we're on in our program array, and we know which row we're on in our screen array, or in our screen line. if we want to go and look at each of the different blocks, let me get rid of the highlighter. If we want to go and look at each of the blocks, so the first block I'm looking at here is the OnUpdate block. What my slide is telling me here is that this OnUpdate block, it allows row modification during the display array, and because we have OnUpdate, it means that we automatically create action. And when this OnUpdate is triggered, the dialog is going to execute whatever code you have out there in the OnUpdate block. So it will trigger the input without defaults from the screen. Now, before it goes into this code, it's going to set our variables int flag to false, and it's going to set the status to 0. So the int flag, if you remember, is our interrupt flag. That's something that comes inherently inside of a Genero application, and it's out there to allow our program to capture when the user presses an interrupt key. I'm most common when I've been on, I think, Unix systems to do a Control-C. That's saying I want to interrupt the program. So before we get into the OnUpdate, it's going to set the int flag to false. If you do a Control-C, if you interrupt it, the int flag is going to be set to true. And that comes important when we're on OnUpdate. It puts us into our input statement. If you do a Control-C, then it knows that the flag has switched from false to true, and it won't go ahead and execute the actual input itself. So once you've made your changes, if the int flag is false and the status is 0, we know that you meant to do it, you haven't done an interrupt, and the modified values are kept and they're updated into our array, and they're kept in the screen record. So each of these slides has a sentence that says the dialog handles only row modification actions and navigation. You have to provide the input statement. That being said, the input statement, however, tends to be a pretty generic input statement that you're able to use across your different arrays and your different screens, because you're saying I want to input from the current array from the current screen line. So you're just specifying which array and which screen line you're using. Let me go to my application here. I'm actually going to open up my display form. I noticed that I had actually had my update button wasn't showing, and I know that's because I had a double-click action, so let me remove this, save it, and compile my file. So I wanted to go up to my display array. Let me execute this program. Execute. Okay, so here we are in the display array. So when I click the update button, this is created because I have an OnUpdate clause. When I click that update button, it set those flags, the int flag equal to false, and my status is equal to 0. I can go around now. I can update my row. Let me just change this to 999. I haven't done a Control-C, so when I click my OK, the change has been made both in my array and out there in my screen record. Let me cancel out of this. I wanted to show you that because I want to take you to the next line, and this is talking about what people typically expect. So users nowadays, when they see a table out there, they want to be able to double-click on that row to do editing of that table. That's what user experience has told us. And the way we allow this to happen is we define something that's called the double-click attribute. So I can go into my form or into my per file if you're out there coding with per files, and when I find my when I find my table, I can go ahead and I can add a double-click attribute to say when the update trigger or when the update action happens, I want it to happen when a user double-clicks on the row. I want it to kick off that update. So you saw me remove it. I'm going to go and head back in and add it again. So I find my table on the form. Underneath the table on the form, I go and find the double-click property, or the double-click, and if you're in your per file, it's the same type of thing. You're going to the attribute section for the table. You're going to add an attribute called double-click. And then I say, what do I want it to kick off on? So I want it to kick off on update. I've made a modification. In Studio, I can tell I made a modification to the default because now it's in bold. I save my changes. I can compile that file. Now, if I go and I execute, you'll see that the update has disappeared from here. It's now in the double-click action. I double-click on a row, and that allows me to go in and update that row. Mark asked me, can you have both a double-click action and an update button, or are they mutually exclusive? The answer is by default, they are exclusive. You can, however, force this update button to still appear. When we get into the chapter on styles, we're going to talk about setting up a default action view for the update where you can say, regardless of it appearing elsewhere on my form, I want you to have that button also appear inside of my action panel. So by default, they say, well, we only should have it in one place, but you can go in and use an action default setting to make it appear in both places. And right here, so I've included this slide here so that we talked about the double-click action in terms of an update. But of course, if you wanted it to represent an insert, a delete, an append, the double-click, really, you can specify any action that you have defined to be executed when that double-click happens. So we also have an on insert block. Insert block is going to create a row. And with an insert block, you're creating a row before a current row in the list. So there's a few steps that it goes through when it's working on an insert. If you click on the insert, it triggers the insert action. That insert action is going to first do an after row block because we're leaving a row to go into a new row. A new row is going to be created before the current row on the list. The dialog is going to execute on that insert block. And just like any of our actions here, before it actually tries to do this input, it's going to set that in flag equal to false, and it's going to set the status equal to 0, so that if we do an interrupt or if there is some sort of issue, we can trap that and handle it later. But so when it goes into the input, you type in your rows. When you click OK or cancel, it's going to take what is in the screen. It's going to put it into the array, as long as my in flag is still false and my status is 0. And then it's going to do a before row being executed for that new row itself. So with an insert, you end up having an after row block. You have your insert happening itself, and you have a before row block happening for that newly created row. I said this line was going to appear in every slide, and it does. So on the insert, if I want to input, I do my input. Again, I'm just using my array current statement with whatever array I'm dealing with. And I use my current screen line function with whatever screen element I'm talking about. So this is, again, pretty standard code that I can use across inserts for different arrays and different screen records that I'm trying to manage on my form. So OnAppend is like an OnInsert. It's just instead of being before the row that you are currently in, the new row is created at the end of the list. It's going to, when you have an OnAppend action, it means that you're going to have an append. The action itself is going to be named append. And we're going to have the same sequence. We have an after row block executed if one is defined. The new row is created at the end of the list. The OnAppend input statement will be executed. We'll be setting an in flag before to false. We'll be setting the status to 0. The user does their work, and as long as they haven't tried to escape out of it, when they click OK, it'll go ahead and it'll take that screen record and input it into the array. and it'll do that before a row for that new row. So the difference between the onInsert and the onAppend are going to reside around the fact that the append action happens at the end while the insert action happens within the record itself. And by now you're getting familiar with seeing this with this code. My input statement again is going to take my current screen line for my screen record, and it's going to put it into where the cursor is located for array. So just to demonstrate these, I have my display array. Let me execute. And so if I'm on a current row and I click my insert action, it puts the blank row before the row I was on. And now it's waiting for me to enter in something and either accept it or cancel. Let me just enter in a new row. When I click OK, I haven't escaped, and it's gone ahead and it's taken that screen record, and now it's written it back out to my program array. If I do the append action, it puts it at the bottom of the list. I can append whatever row I want to append. And again, if I click OK, I haven't interrupted. It's taken that screen record and it's put it back into my array. If you try to append, when I define my display arrays, I've gotten to the point now where I define them as dynamic arrays so that they can just grow as large as they're needed. If you've defined your array to be of a fixed size and you already filled it up with your and you've reached the maximum number of rows that you said you were going to allow in the array, it's not going to let you do that append. It'll disable that append action. Likewise with an insert. So if it gets to a point, these actions are automatically created for us. If it gets to a point where it doesn't logically make sense for the action to appear because it wouldn't be possible to fulfill it, it's going to disable that action for you. I'll go ahead and leave this up for a second. And I'm going to go to the delete block. So on the delete block, this allows you to delete a row. It knows what row you're trying to delete because you would have been on a row when you clicked the delete action. And since you're not deleting, you either delete all of the row or none of the row, you don't really have to code anything else. It knows what it needs to do. So by putting an onDelete in there, you're going to automatically create a delete action, lowercase delete. The dialog, when it executes the delete block, it does the same thing about how it's set up the int flag equal to 0, and it's waiting for, here we like to ask a question. We like to say, are you sure you want to delete the record? In our first lab that we have you do, and in this chapter, we do this thing called an FGL win question. And the FGL win question allows a message to pop up to typically a delete confirmation. Do you want to delete the record? If yes, then click yes. Otherwise, by default, we're going to, if no, then we're going to set that int flag back to true. So let's see on mine if I've actually, if I go into my code itself, let's see if I've used that. Okay, I have used FGL win question. So if I go to my application and I want to go and I click delete, I have my window pop up. Do you want to delete this row? And this is what's coming from that FGL win question function. I can say yes or no. Let me go ahead and say yes, and that row is deleted. That's all the code that I need out there inside of my delete statement. Pause for a question. Were there any questions about that on insert, on update, on delete, on append? One thing I hope we've noticed out there, and I'm going to turn to my actual code itself when I look at this, is that you can see the code. It's very simple code. I've defined an array, and let me go up. I'll go to the top. So I've defined an array. I have my array sitting out there. In this case, it was just an array. It was a dynamic array of so that it could grow as needed, and I just happened. This was a very quick one with 2 columns. I have my screen record inside of my form design. If I go to my screen record, I have my screen record, and it was just built with the two columns, F1 and F2. So when I got to my code, because we're not using a database here, we went ahead and we just populated it with 10 records through using a loop here. And then I displayed my array to my screen record, and the screen record was mapped out there to the table. So if I look at my form here, I have my table, and my table was pulling in from that screen record. There's my column F1, my column F2, and that's my screen record was SR_1. What controls the order of the buttons in the action list? So I got another question. So when it appears, what controls? So we have insert, depend, delete, and append here. You know, I'm not 100% sure what controls the order. I will take a look and see if it's done by our action defaults file, but I'm not 100% sure. Let me make a note on that. And if I don't know by the end of class today, I'll find out for tomorrow. No. Yeah, in general, just from my experience of building applications, people that are concerned about the order of the buttons don't let the action default panel handle it for them. They will go and they will actually physically place the buttons on the form as where they want them to be. So it's just a question I've never asked myself before. So I will take a look at that. So back to our code itself. When I got to my display array, I have my array and I have my screen record. And you can see, so the code is just taking the current array row and mapping it to the current screen row. My input, my update, and my append statements are pretty standard statements. If I could change my array, if I had a different array, if I had a different screen record, I could be changing those pretty easily. I think so. That's going to be, you're going to see this when you do your coding itself. One other thing I wanted to show you is many of you are used to doing on-action update, on-action delete. What happens if we have an on-action update and we have an on-update? So if I save this, if I try to compile this, what you're going to see at the bottom is it's failed to compile. It's failed to compile, and my error message should be an 8408. And that's just saying you can't have an on-action update and an on-update. It doesn't make sense to have both of them. So you're going to be allowed to have one or the other in your display statement. And that's going to be true with on-action delete and an on-delete, or an on-action insert and an insert statement. That's just how it works. So Rhoda asked me, what happens if you swap the order of the actions in the code in terms of the button order? I was wondering about that. So here I have insert, delete, and append. Let's see if we move append up. So I've moved append up. I want to execute. Let's see, compile. Let me close out my function, cancel. Append, insert, delete. Okay, so here it seems to have gone in the order of where it appears in the code. What I want to make sure in code, I want to see what happens if there's a way we can also override that with styles as well. And like the OK and the cancel are the two that are set up for the dialog. I don't see a way to influence those up here in my display array. I could do an onAccept and an onCancel action here, but then once I add those in, I would actually have to write the code itself, because I would be overriding by default the onAccept is the OK button, and that's saying you're done with your display array dialog. So I would have to to code over that if I was to put those in myself. So, based on the experience now, it seems like these buttons down here were influenced by the order of our list. The OK and cancel, however, they're part of the display array, and I'm not sure how I would move those down without physically putting buttons out there. Okay, so those were our on action, on update, on delete, on insert. There's also display array control blocks. So we have a before display and after display, and those allow you to do any sort of initialization functions that you want to have. So if I do a before display, it executes when we first go into the display array, and it's where you can do any sort of dialog initialization tasks that you want to have. If you have an after display, it's also only done one time. It's after the user has validated or canceled the dialog, and it's before the runtime and before it continues on with the instructions that are after the display array block. And that's where you would do any sort of dialog finalization. We also have, and more commonly used, I would think, we have before row and we have after row. So before row, it's executed every time a user moves to another row. And as you saw in our insert or in our append, those both triggered before row actions. But really, any time that you're moving to another row, after the destination row is made the current row, that's when we execute a before row. It's executed for the current row when the dialog starts. And we have that array current to return the index of the new current row. And when you do an after row, well, that's executed when the mover moves to another row, but it's before leaving the current row. And it's typically used to execute code that's related to that row change, and the array cur in this case will return the index of the row that will be left. Now I'm going to go to the next chart just to kind of say, this chart is inside of our documentation. And it provides you what I call the display array control block execution order. And that's how you know, so when do we hit our before display, when do we hit our before row, when do we hit our after row, and when do we hit our after display. So when you first enter the dialog, you're going to hit a before display and a before row. If I'm moving from one row to a next row, I'm going to add an after row for the current row and a before row for the new row. When I'm validating the dialog, I first hit the after row, and then I hit the after display. If I'm canceling the dialog, I still hit an after row for that current row. If I'm doing an insert or an append, I'm going to have an after row, I'm going to do my on insert or my on append, and then I'm going to hit a before row. And if I'm doing a delete action, I'm going to do an after row on the current row, I hit a delete, and then I have a before row on whatever was the next row or wherever that cursor is going to go off to. So when you first start working with the display array, and you may want to keep this kind of chart happening or close by so that you understand exactly when you put in an after row statement, where does it get applied? And you can see it gets applied up here in 5 of our 6 situations. It's basically every time you do any sort of action other than initially entering the dialog, that after row is going to be hit for the current row where that cursor is at. So this is a table to go through if you want to just make sure when am I hitting my after row, when am I hitting my before row, and which row are they referring to. Okay, let me go back to my code section and just say, okay, on this one I don't actually have any real after row or before row stuff happening in this demo. I think when we get into our labs for tomorrow, we start doing a little bit more of the after row and the before row triggers. Okay, I kind of want to shift gears. So that's what we were talking about when we talk about coding with the display array. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some things that have been added in terms of a built-in find and a built-in seek. So the built-in find, it's going to let users find rows by entering a value in a pop-up window that's created for you. So this is given to you in a library. We've created this find window for you. If you want to go out there and modify how this find window looks and feel, you can go in. It's a 4RD file. It's a form definition file, so you can go in and modify the look and feel of this if you want to change its text, if you want to just change how it appears. But we provided for this you out of the box, this box right here. And if you're in a display array, by default, this will exist for you. You can, of course, disable the find action so you can take it away, but by default, it's given for you. By default, we've associated it to a default accelerator of Control F. So you're not going to have a button that appears that says find. It's a key-only accelerator by default. So we have an implicit find, we have an implicit find next. Control F is linked to the find. Control G is linked to the find next. It'll search on anything that's text-based. So if it's a column that has special widgets like checkbox images, it's not going to search on those. It's not going to search on byte values. It works with any container. So a table, a tree, or a scroll grid. The row has to be in memory. So if you're working in paged mode, which is, I can't imagine why people would still be working in page mode today, but if you have applications that work in page mode, it's only going to work on those rows that have been brought into memory. So let me just show you how this works. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Let me go to a different application that's a little more exciting. I believe it's the account array application. Okay, so I'm going to display my rows here. So if I want the built-in find, I do my Control F. It brings up my find. I can go ahead and just search for a value. Let me search for D. So somewhere it's found a D. You'll notice in case sensitive, so it found Dennis, or found Fred. If I want to do a Control F again, I want to do a capital D. Let me not ignore case. Now it's gone and it's found Dennis. If I do Control G, it's going to find the next one, DuPont. If I do another Control G, I think these are just going to swap back and forth. It was searching across all the columns. I could go and I could say, well, I want it to only look in the first name column. I can do the search. It didn't find anything because there is nothing beginning with D in the capital D in the first name column. The other was called the built-in seek. So a built-in seek is where if you have a big table and you're trying to find something and you know what you're looking for, I could just start typing keys. So I'm going to just start with a B. I'd hit a B and you'll notice it went to blog. If I hit a G, it went to Garcia. A built-in search, built-in seek, let me go to that slide, automatically seeks when the user starts typing characters. So if I start typing a name like blogs, B-L-O-G-G-S, it's going to go and it's going to find it. It works on, it's a time-based thing, so if you stop typing and then you continue a bit later, it picks up as if as if you're starting something new. It's not a case-sensitive search, but it's what people expect from a table or a tree. If I go out here and I go to my form and I click on a column and I want to be able to find Miller, I should be able to start typing Miller and it finds it for me. Now here in our demonstration, this is a pretty small table, so it's not, you know, you're seeing the row pretty quickly. But if this was a very long table, it's a good way to quickly go without having to go into Control F, without having to deal with a find box. I can just go ahead and start typing the name, and it's going to bring me to whatever name I start to type. You'll notice that once I select a column, it's only working within that column. So if I want to look at email address, I can type Fred right now. It's not finding anything because I'm not in a column that has Fred. But now if I type Fred, and now if I type Charles, it's going to find them because I've selected that column. So of course you can turn off seek, you can turn off the built-in finds. There are things that we provided for you because customers expect them. If they're in a table view or a tree view or a scroll grid, they expect to be able to search it and they expect to be able to find the record they're looking for easily. In this slide up here, we mentioned that this is done for a display array. It's also for an input array. So really anywhere that you have a container that has multiple, you have a list container, you're going to be able to, you'll have the built-in find for you, and you'll have that built-in seek for you. Okay, so that's our talking about the display array, the new editable display array, or the editable display array that was added with 2.4.1. Are there any questions out there currently about the editable display array, or the built-in find, or the built-in seek?